Okay, so yeah, I'd like to finally welcome all of you who are here to the last OPP discussion group. I was just discussing with Rachel about the current climate, as people keep calling it, but the sort of uprising against racism and sexism and other issues, and also what philosophy students are doing at Oxford. So there is a group working on this, and I would just quickly like to highlight that. So if you'd like to be involved or interested in knowing what we're doing, just talk to me or Alice Hank afterwards. And so anyway, I'd like to introduce Dr. Rachel Fraser, who's a tutor at Exeter College. She's an associate professor at Oxford, and she's going to be talking to us today about carceral feminism and intersectionality. So yeah, over to you, Rachel.
Great, thank you so much for having me. Okay, so I've just sent everyone a link in the chat to a handout, which might help just to sort of keep track of the discussion, and it's got some references on it as well. So just to flag that as a thing you can look at now to keep track of the discussion, and later if you want to follow up on some of the arguments I'll be talking about today. Okay, so I'll get started. In 2017, Gina Martin was at a music festival in London when a man put his phone between her legs and started taking pictures. When she informed the police about what happened, she was horrified to learn that no law made upskirting a specific offence. She began a campaign to make upskirting illegal. Theresa May was sympathetic. Theresa May said, upskirting is degrading and humiliating. Offenders should feel the full force of the law. In April 2019, Gina Martin's efforts paid off. A new law was passed. Upskirting became a specific offence under English law. This story of Gina Martin and her campaign to make upskirting illegal is often read as a story of feminist progress and feminist triumph. And some parts of this story are indisputable. What happened to Gina Martin was serious and was wrong. Many women face a continual pattern of sexualized harassment when in public spaces, and this is an affront to their freedom and to their equality. It's also clear that Gina Martin responded to this affront with courage and determination, and she should be admired for her courage and her determination. But I want to focus on a different part of this picture. I want to focus on the assumptions that are embedded in this picture about the role of the law in feminist activism and feminist organizing. Many feminists assume that the law is their best, or at the very least, an indispensable tool in the fight against sexual violence. Consider the widespread assumption, practically taken to be axiomatic in many feminist contexts, that it should be a goal of feminist organizing to increase conviction rates for rape. Consider too the widespread feminist advocacy for policies like mandatory arrest. That is a policy whereby police officers are required to make an arrest whenever they arrive at a scene of domestic violence. As Koshka Duff puts it, many feminists assume that the struggle against sexual violence is fundamentally at odds with any deep opposition to the criminalizing state. So we can call those feminists who seek to harness the power of the criminalizing state for feminist ends, we'll call those feminists carceral feminists. And what I'll be doing in this talk is I'll be considering some reasons to be wary of carceral feminism. Now, arguments against carceral feminism often rely on very strong background assumptions about politics. So very often arguments against carceral politics will rely on something like an anarchist flavored commitment to the idea that liberatory movements should always have an antagonistic relationship to the state. Now, I don't think these anarchist commitments are obviously false. In fact, I'm quite sympathetic to some of these anarchist flavored commitments, but they're not feminist commitments per se. Not all feminists are or need be anarchists. So what I'll be doing in this talk is trying to give you some arguments against carceral feminism that are effective even if you're not a signed up anarchist, even if you are some other political persuasion, right? So I'm going to try and offer you arguments against carceral feminism that should be acceptable to feminists with a wide range of political convictions. Now, before I start, it's worth saying a bit about why carceral feminism has the prominence and the appeal that it does. Carceral feminism, I think, can be thought of as one attractive way to solve a dilemma that faces all feminists. On the one hand, a long tradition in feminist thinking identifies the state as a patriarchal institution, as an institution which is responsible for replicating patriarchy. As Catherine McKinnon puts it, the state protects male power through embodying and ensuring existing male control over women at every level, cushioning, qualifying, or de jure appearing to prohibit its excesses when necessary to normalization. On the other hand, of course, any feminism worthy of the name needs to take seriously and to struggle against rape, sexual assault, and other forms of violence against women. Carceral feminism represents one attempt to reconcile these two strands of feminist thinking. Carceral feminists seek to redeploy the power of the state for feminist ends. They want to take the state away from its traditional role as a maintainer of patriarchal order and instead harness the power of the state to realize feminist goals. And carceral feminism has one clear point in its favour. It really does seem to take seriously sexual violence because it advocates for the imprisonment and punishment of sexual violence's perpetrators. So arguments against carceral feminism can be rhetorically and politically risky because they can often seem, or sometimes actually be, thinly disguised apologies for sexual violence. The challenge for anti-carceral feminists is to articulate a case against carceral feminism that avoids that pitfall, that avoids functioning as a form of apologism for sexual violence. So in this talk, I'm going to be considering three different arguments against carceral feminism. The first two, I'll argue, are not especially persuasive. The third argument against carceral feminism, I think, is extremely persuasive. So the first argument I want to consider is what I'm calling the argument from agency. So the argument from agency has three premises. The first premise is a description of carceral feminism's goals. The first premise is carceral feminists seek legal protections and legal remedies for women as such. Second premise is that legal protections and legal remedies for women as such authoritatively represent women as such, as helpless and injured and in need of protection. When women, then the third premise comes, the third premise says, when women are authoritatively represented as helpless and injured, they become helpless and injured. And the conclusion of this argument is that then carceral feminists render women helpless and injured. So if this conclusion is true, it's certainly a significant problem for carceral feminism. But I don't think we need to find this argument persuasive. And there are a few different reasons I don't find this argument persuasive, but the big reason I think this argument is not persuasive is that I don't find the second premise of this argument compelling. So I don't find the claim that legal protections and legal remedies for women as such authoritatively represent women as helpless and injured. So to see why I don't find this premise persuasive, it's helpful to unpack a bit the background behind premise two. So the background behind premise two is something like this. The background is the assumption that the law has what we might call a kind of expressive power. The law does more than simply divide actions up into the permissible and the forbidden. The law also represents its subjects. The law represents the things it regulates as having certain features, certain properties, and certain qualities. Now, I'm broadly sympathetic to this idea. I think the law does have this kind of expressive power. What I don't like about premise two is the idea that representing a group as in need of protection amounts to representing them as passive and injured. So I don't think the fact that the legal protections carceral feminists propose represent women as in need of protection, I don't think that's enough to justify the claim that the legal protections and remedies carceral feminists propose represent women as passive and helpless. And the best way to see why there's a gap between these two claims is to think about other people who are protected by the law, other classes of people who are protected by the law as such. So my favorite example here is the kind of protections that are offered to property owners as such. A core function of the law in a liberal capitalist state is to protect the property order. It's to provide property owners with protection and remedies if their property is stolen. So this quite clearly represents property owners as in need of legal protection. However, it doesn't seem that property owners are thus represented as passive or injured in any objectionable way. So I don't think we can make this move that premise 2 wants to make from the claim that carceral feminist remedies represent women as in need of protection to the claim that carceral feminist remedies represent women as helpless and injured. So I don't think this argument against carceral feminism is compelling because it relies on a false claim. Okay, so what about the second argument against carceral feminism? The second argument against carceral feminism I want to consider is what I'm calling the argument from complicity. So the argument from complicity goes like this. Its first premise is the claim that carceral feminism is complicit with the state. The second claim is that the state systematically inflicts sexualized violence on women. And the argument from complicity concludes then that carceral feminism is complicit in the sexualized violence inflicted on women by the state. I think this is quite a powerful argument. I think this is more powerful than the first argument. I think the first premise is true. Carceral feminism, almost by definition, seeks to embed feminism and feminist projects within state institutions. And I think the second premise is also true. Consider the role played by strip searching in the criminal justice system. As Koshka Duff points out, strip searching of arrestees by police is standard in the UK, and strip searching may involve a police officer peering into your anus or vagina, inserting his fingers or a whole hand into your vagina or your anus. Duff also quotes Laura Whitehorn recalling her time in prison. She says, "On a regular basis, I was forced to stand still and allow men to touch my body in ways that would automatically have provoked me to fight back if I had been outside of prison." The point Duff wants to make is that the operations of the criminal justice system routinely and systematically involve men being granted access to the most intimate and private parts of women's bodies. This is not a matter of misbehaving individuals or even a culture of illegal abuse. Rather, these intrusions are built into the intended functioning of the system. Strip searching is perfectly legal. So it's highly plausible then that carceral feminism is complicit in some sense in sexual and sexualized violence against women that is inflicted by the state as part of its ordinary operations. However, it's not clear that this complicity is a mark against carceral feminism in any obvious sense, because it is simply not clear whether purity is either a reasonable or a realistic goal for feminists. For the argument from complicity to have force against carceral feminism, we would need strong and independent reasons for thinking that complicity with oppressive force is never politically excusable. I don't think there's no plausible argument for that, but I don't think it's obvious that complicity is always politically inexcusable. So it's not obvious that the argument from complicity gives us strong reasons for rejecting carceral feminism. The third argument I want to consider, I think, is the most powerful argument against carceral feminism. The third argument is an extremely powerful, to my mind, argument against carceral feminism. And this third argument is what I'm calling the argument from intersectionality. So the argument from intersectionality goes like this. It says, look, the remedies that are proposed by carceral feminists may well protect privileged white women from sexual violence and may well succeed in offering privileged white women appropriate remedies when they face sexual violence. But they don't do either of these things for marginalized women. And in fact, worse than that, they actually increase the risk of sexual violence for marginalized women. So not only do carceral feminists fail to aid the most marginalized women, they actually make the most marginalized women more vulnerable to sexual violence than they would be in the absence of a carceral feminist regime. So clearly, if the conclusion of this is correct, this is a very powerful case against carceral feminism. So why think the argument is correct? To see why there's a good case for thinking this argument is correct, it's helpful to look at one example of a carceral feminist remedy and look at the ways in which it harms marginalised women. So the example I want to focus on is the policy of mandatory arrest. So this policy differentially impacts privileged white women and more marginalised women, and it does so for three interlocking reasons. So the first reason policies of mandatory arrest, just as a reminder, policy of mandatory arrest says police, when they are called to a scene of domestic violence, must make an arrest. These policies, which have been advocated for by many, many feminists, are harmful. There's a lot of evidence that they're extremely harmful and increase the vulnerability of the most marginalised women to sexual violence. Okay, so reason one they do this is what I'm calling the risk of arrest and deportation. So there are two main groups of women we need to consider in connection with this reason. The first group of women we want to consider are migrant women. So more than half of UK police forces have a policy of arresting or revealing to the Home Office the whereabouts of migrant survivors of domestic violence. The second group of women we need to consider are women of colour, and in particular, Black women. So there's evidence that Black women, this is evidence in America that's drawn from America, but I think it's relevant here too. So there's evidence that if Black women call the police as a result of domestic violence, they are at an elevated risk of arrest themselves. So they are elevated a risk of arrest as secondary aggressors or mutual combatants. So what this means is that if a Black woman calls the police, there's a good chance she herself will be arrested, perhaps for having defended herself. She'll be read as a combatant rather than as a victim. And so Black feminists have speculated that this is because Black women are sort of stereotyped as strong, aggressive, and violent. So the upshot of this is that marginalised women face a dual threat. Fear of arrest and deportation will prevent marginalised women from accessing the very social institutions that are supposed to protect them from violence. If they do avail themselves of those social institutions, they may well be detained or arrested, and thus at a highly elevated risk of sexual violence. You know, who are the people who are most at risk of sexual violence? Prisoners and detainees. So, bad situation. The second reason we need to consider that policies of mandatory arrest can be harmful to the most marginalised women is a reason most heavily theorised by the Black feminist Beth Ritchie. So Beth Ritchie argues that there's a phenomenon that she calls the loyalty trap. So Beth Ritchie's view is that the rhetoric of racial solidarity disincentivises Black women from taking action which risks imprisoning Black men. So she writes, Black women's roles in their community have been organised around notions of allegiance to family, dedication to collective advancement, and respectability. Black women experience tremendous pressure associated with bearing a disproportionate burden for caring for the community. When they cannot or choose not to perform the roles that responsibility demands, the consequences are considerable. So the idea here is that Black women are expected to perform by their own communities a disproportionate amount of the labour associated with what Ritchie calls racial uplift. And they're punished by their own communities when they fail to take on this disproportionate burden. Black women who violate these norms of social solidarity, of racial solidarity, risk isolation and censure. So one might wonder, well, why not simply change these sexist norms? There are two reasons why that's not the answer. The first reason is that it obscures the fact that Black women's interests really are tied in multiple ways to the interests of Black men. Black communities as a whole are harmed by phenomena like mass incarceration and racist policing. It's perfectly understandable that Black women would seek to avoid what might seem to them a form of complicity in racial injustice. Even more significantly, they may be perfectly aware that any appeals they make to the police may be weaponized against their own community. Their appeals may be used to justify more intrusive and more violent policing of the Black women's own communities, which will in turn increase the risk of police violence directed towards those women and their families. Second, this sexist expectation that's faced by Black women, the expectation that they will take on more of the work of, as Ritchie calls it, racial uplift, this is a product of the disadvantages, the racist disadvantages that are faced by Black men. So as Ritchie sees things, it is precisely because Black men are so thoroughly criminalised in the social imaginary that Black women are expected to perform the labour of racial uplift. So any serious attempt to dismantle these sexist norms would require a reckoning with the systematic racism that casts Black men as so thoroughly criminalised. The upshot of this story that says what Ritchie calls the loyalty trap, the upshot is that carceral remedies to domestic violence have a tendency to place Black women in a distinctively racialised double bind. Either they involve the police in situations of domestic violence, risk adding to the heavy racialised policing of their own communities and make themselves more vulnerable in the future to police violence, or they and risk censure by their own communities, or they do not involve the police and risk exposing themselves to further violence. The third reason we need to consider that policies of mandatory arrest are disproportionately harmful to Black women is that we need to think about the different ways in which privacy is thought of, conceptualized, and embedded in different traditions of feminism. So within white feminism, the private sphere is typically analysed as an artefact of patriarchal power. It's analysed as working to shield the domestic sphere from the demands of justice. It works to legitimise male domination within the domestic sphere, within the home. As Catherine McKinnon puts it, a right to privacy looks like an injury got up as a gift. However, privacy is conceptualised, historically, privacy has been conceptualised very differently within Black feminist thought. So as Dorothy Roberts remarks, where white feminist legal theory focuses on the private realm of the family as an institution of violence and subordination, women of colour often experience the family as a source of solace and resistance against racial oppression. Black women are often operating against a state, a sort of background assumption that the state is going to attempt to intrude in their lives in multiple ways. Poor and Black women are at a higher risk of losing custody of their children. They're often expected to reveal highly intimate details of their lives in order to access the welfare system or to have access to housing. Thus, the decision to effectively invite the power of the state into the intimate sphere, that kind of decision is going to be calibrated very differently for marginalized women when compared to privileged women. Marginalized women will often be intensely aware that if they call the police, that act may trigger a cascade of state interventions that could well result in disasters like eviction or loss of custody of their children. Okay, so we have these three reasons. We have the risk of arrest or deportation, the loyalty trap, as Ritchie calls it, and the value of privacy. And these three reasons combine and interlock to mean that policies of mandatory arrest actually, instead of protecting the most marginalized women from domestic violence, render them more vulnerable to domestic violence for a complex suite of interlocking reasons related to their social position. So it turns out that if feminists want to ameliorate the situation of the most marginalized women, if they want to protect the most marginalized women from sexual violence, policies like mandatory arrest are not the way to go. So I've been focusing on mandatory arrest as an example here, but the kinds of problems with mandatory arrest as a policy generalize across a whole host of characteristic carceral feminist remedies. So the moral of the story is that if you want to take sexual violence seriously, carceral feminism is not the way to do it. Carceral feminism actually fails to take sexual violence seriously because it fails to attend to the ways in which carceral feminist remedies actually increase vulnerability to sexual violence rather than reducing it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Rachel. Yeah, I'm always like astounded by the way you speak. I just think it's really cool. So if anyone has any questions, you can turn your video on, you can like wave at me, or you can type in the chat. You can either type the question in the chat, I'll read it aloud, or you can ask to speak so that you can actually ask your question. Are there any questions now? I do sort of have one, which isn't exactly about the issue of carceral feminism, but more about what I think is like about feminist philosophy more in general. So it seems to be, particularly in these arguments, that there's a lot of use of case studies, and I'm quite interested in how case studies seem to be used in feminist philosophy and perhaps other areas of philosophy that I'm less familiar with, whereas thought experiments seem to take precedent in perhaps more analytic traditions. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that, or if anyone has any thoughts on that, and why that is, and perhaps why that's useful.
Great, that's such a fantastic question. Yeah, that is a really interesting asymmetry, and I think it's a genuine asymmetry, right? So I think you're right that these kinds of highly idealized, very sort of cleaned up and artificial thought experiments receive more heavy use within the more mainstream, perhaps, areas of the analytic tradition. Within feminist philosophy, there's much more of a focus on attending to sort of the actual complex, layered, textured reality of like women's lived experience, and there's much more engagement with things like the sociology literature and the international development literature. So one thing I would say is that it probably is helpful here not to over idealize feminist philosophy. So there are definitely areas of feminist philosophy where kind of a reliance on oversimplified models of how the world works are responsible for theories that have kind of unpalatable political resonances. So I think the place this is most obvious is when we think about the way in which debates within feminist philosophy around sort of non-Western cultural practices has evolved. So, you know, Susan Oken wrote this paper, I can't remember exactly what it's called, something like Is Multiculturalism Bad for Women? Perhaps familiar to many of you. Nussbaum has also written extensively on the idea that sort of non-Western cultural traditions might be particularly hostile to feminist goals. But in more recent years, what's happened is fantastic feminist philosophers like Serene Kader have shown that actually the sort of image or picture of non-Western cultural traditions that's being relied on by these feminists is artificial, oversimplified, doesn't properly engage with, you know, the up-to-date sort of sociological literature. So I think it's important not to sort of overly valorize feminist philosophy, because especially when these issues of race come into feminist philosophy, I think feminist philosophy is guilty of many of the failings of more mainstream philosophy, right, in relying on sort of crude, artificial, and frankly biased pictures of the world. So that's one thing. We need to be careful not to sort of erase the sins of feminist philosophy in an attempt to, you know, argue for its superiority in many ways to more mainstream philosophy. So that's one thing. Coming back to your main point about the contrast, I think one reason we see this difference is because of this broader difference between traditions which are oriented towards ideal theory and traditions which are oriented towards non-ideal theory, right? So if you're interested in sort of what the ideal world would look like, it makes sense to start with very simple, very artificial sort of thought experiments, because you're going to reduce as much noise as possible, right? You're going to get the sort of cleanest intuitions that you can. But of course, if you're more interested in non-ideal theory, if you're not interested in what the ideal situation would look like, but rather in what sorts of interventions would be justice enhancing, then obviously you're going to want as complete a picture of the world as it actually is, or your predictions about what sorts of interventions are going to be justice enhancing risk being wrong and actually risk harming people rather than helping them. So I think that kind of practical orientation and that orientation towards non-ideal theory and justice enhancement is probably a big part of why there's this tradition of attention to far more sort of nuanced, textured cases in feminist philosophy.
Okay, thank you for that. Yeah, I wonder if philosophy could be perceived as more useful if case studies were used more generally. Does anyone else have any questions?
Yeah, something that I was thinking about, like, throughout your thing is obviously one of the things you talked about is these ideas of intersectionality and the data that you have on, you know, how like a lot of marginalized women, you know, like sex workers as well as just, you know, women of color, when they are the ones, you know, appealing to the state for help, they are the ones who are actually being punished for it. And I was wondering whether there have been any more, like, but you know, that's not a new idea. So I was wondering if there's been like any contemporary research by carceral feminists or who advocate for it, who've actually taken that on board and have like, you know, have like a rebuttal to it or something like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not actually sure, right? So there may well be, and I might just not be aware of it. I haven't read anything that's a sort of response on behalf of carceral feminists taking this seriously. But I think I can imagine what they should say, right? So I think the best response on behalf of carceral feminists would be not like a sort of wholehearted defense of like the crudest version of carceral feminism, but rather something like, okay, well, these critiques are real and serious, but the solution is not to abandon the attempt to use the law, but to realize that the law alone is not going to do everything that we need. So for example, you might think something like, well, policies of mandatory arrest would be far less disastrous in a context where there was access to everyone sort of on demand to public housing, right? Because then, you know, the police wouldn't be the primary agent, the primary social agent required to sort of mediate between the state and society, between the state and individuals who are searching for ways out of situations involving domestic violence. So I think sort of a sort of retreat to a more sort of complex, like sort of multi-vector position is probably what sensible carceral feminists should do. They should say, look, these aren't arguments against legal reform at all. They're just arguments against legal reform without these sort of supplementary procedures involving things like far greater housing security, far greater access to like substantial, you know, things like universal basic income, for example, you might think are going to be far more effective ways of preventing things like domestic violence than relying on legal reform.
Okay, and thanks for that question, Trucy. Do we have any more questions? It is rather quiet today. Yeah, Olivia, you can go ahead.
Thank you so much for your talk, Rachel. That was wonderful. So my question is kind of about the fleshing out of anti-carceral feminism. Yeah. So you said that you wanted to make an argument that is appealing to kind of people with a wide range of feminist commitments or political commitments, and I think that's, you know, a good way to go. But I would be interested. I think so. I have the strong intuition that you can only make the strong argument from intersectionality, or that the argument from intersectionality would be even more appealing if it would be made from a more radical stance that might have some anarchist commitments, but maybe doesn't have to. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that.
Okay, so are there two questions there in a sense? So it seems like one question is something like, to what extent is it accurate to present the argument from intersectionality as sort of floating free from any kind of radical political commitment? And the second question is like, you know, like essentially what's the alternative to carceral feminism? You know, if we want to sort of reduce sexual violence, but we don't want to risk being complicit in systems of mass incarceration, what do we do? So is that right? Have I got the two questions correct? Okay, good. So the first question, the question on intersectionality, is an excellent and very interesting question, and one that I'm genuinely still trying to think through for myself. So, for example, a really famous legal theorist just published an argument in favor of the idea that intersectionality is a tool which should be sort of thoroughly adopted by all liberal political philosophers. And this argument doesn't strike me as obviously wrong. I think that many of the commitments of liberalism, actually sort of thought through carefully, would lead you to something that looks a lot like a Crenshaw-style intersectionality. So I'm not persuaded that appeals to intersectionality on their own have anything like a sort of radical political commitment. You might think that's a defect in intersectionality. You might think that it's a perk, right? That sort of intersectional commitments are compatible with a wide range of background views. I'm not totally sure about this. As I say, it's something I'm still trying to think through, is the sort of like what we should say about the political valence of intersectionality generally. I would say I don't think it's an argument that certain aspects of intersectionality have been so amenable to a kind of like what we might call like neoliberalized form of identity politics. I don't think that's an accident, and I think it does tell you something important about the political valence of intersectionality, which is not of course to say that intersectionality shouldn't be taken seriously, but I do think that people are often very keen to reach for intersectionality as a kind of political silver bullet, as though if we take intersectionality on its own seriously, we'll be able to solve all political problems. And I think I don't agree with that, or I'm not inclined to agree with that. I think intersectionality, precisely because it's compatible, it's very flexible, it's compatible with a wide range of political orientations, can be adopted by people with very liberal politics, as well as people with much more radical left-wing politics. But yeah, as I say, I'm totally open to persuasion on that. I might be wrong. So as for the second question, yeah, I think this is a great question and a really, really tough question. So there are a bunch of different models out there, for things like sort of transformative justice that I really want to be on board with, right? And I think I basically was on board with them until last summer when I went to a talk by the philosopher Christy Dotson, right? So Dotson is known in analytic philosophy for her work in epistemic injustice, but she gave this incredible talk on critiques of transformative justice projects. So essentially critiques of these feminist, anti-racist politics attempting to provide alternative systems of justice outside of the context of the criminal justice system. And I'll try and give you a sense of what her worry was. So she began with a story. So it was a story about her visiting, so I think she lives in Michigan, her job's in Michigan anyway. So she went to Detroit and she had her phone stolen and she chased after the people who took her phone, and she ended up getting kicked in the head and got really bad concussion. So there were a few things she wanted us to draw from this story. So the first thing was that she wasn't like in her own community. She wasn't somewhere she knew people. So there wasn't anyone she could call, right, if she wanted to implement some kind of alternative system of justice, right? It was like the police or nothing. So that was one point she wanted to make, that basically often these models of sort of alternative justice, transformative justice, rely on a sort of picture of society where everyone knows each other, right? It's not an accident that very often the sort of basics of these ideas are drawn from indigenous people like the Maori, right? But of course, sort of contemporary, like late capitalist society, just a very different social context. People are often in places where they don't have like deep sort of kin-based relationships with many other people. So any sort of adequate system of transformative justice, like Christy Dotson was arguing, has to be sensitive to that. And she thinks that sort of transformative justice advocates thus far have not been sensitive enough to that and presuppose a model of society in which everybody is operating in sort of rich kinship structures. She didn't put it quite like that, but I think that was basically the idea she was getting at. The second point she wanted to make was that she was trying to make a bunch of decisions when she was concussed and terrified, right? So what she said was, the thing is, it's like, when you think about the criminal justice system, it's streamlined, right? It's not difficult, right? It's sort of taken out of your hands. You need to make a call, and then everything is like institutionalized, right? And this is often regarded as a defect by people with kind of anarchist politics, precisely as it's institutionalization. But her point was, look, a system needs to be able to be usable by terrified people with concussion, or it's not up to the job, right? So sort of, like, you might think of it as a kind of like naive anarchism that's opposed to any kind of like solid institutionalization. Like Dotson just thought that wasn't sustainable because it isn't sensitive to the kind of terrified, exhausted, concussed people that actually need to make use of these institutions. And I thought this was a very powerful critique. I don't have anything to say about this. I don't think I have anything to add to this debate beyond like the incredible, like mainly Black feminists who've argued both on the sort of pro-transformative justice side and people like Dotson who are more sort of wary of it. I don't know what to say really. I think this is just an incredibly difficult problem feminists need to come up with some alternative. Carceral feminism is not cutting it, but I don't think there are any like scalable, obviously workable models out there. Yeah.
Thanks, that was super helpful.
Thank you for that. Do we have any more questions? Or if anyone would just like to make a point or anything. I know it's a bit weird like having a discussion group on Zoom, but it's what we've got. I can see movements being made.
Sorry, hi. I don't know very much about carceral feminism, and so this is maybe not that, like, I don't know, but is carceral feminism a feminism that looks to change the state and maintain there being a relationship that's like the state is in charge and like civilians maintain them, are civilians, and the state has the power and civilians obliged to the desires and demands of the state? Or is it one that is, or does it try and change the state so that its breakdown is more feasible? I don't know. Like I said, I don't know anything about carceral feminism, so I don't know if I'm just...
No, that's a great question. Yeah, great question. Yeah, okay, so this is kind of slightly tricky to answer because carceral feminism is one of these, it's a contested term, right? Like, it's one of those things, like, nobody calls themselves a carceral feminist, right? It's a label which is always applied with derision, right? It's, nobody sort of proudly comes along and says, I am a carceral feminist. I am in favor of imprisoning more Black men, you know? So, yeah, it's kind of tricky to see exactly what the commitments of carceral feminism are. I would say the critics of carceral feminism would probably want to identify it much more with the latter, right? And I think a lot of critics of carceral feminism basically want to diagnose a tendency within feminist thinking, which is, in their view, insufficiently skeptical of the state, right? Or the thought is something like, you know, there is this way of thinking about sort of feminist, where feminism is basically a matter of, you know, the sort of very crude example is like, we just need, you know, a 50-50 split of women in parliament, but parliament itself will be fine if there are just enough women in it, right? Like, so I think there is a tendency to think, look, the state per se is a legitimate structure. The state as it stands is only illegitimate because it is insufficiently attentive to the needs and concerns of women. But in principle, there's no reason something state-like could be, there's no reason why something state-like could not be legitimate, right? Yes, so does that help answer your question? Okay, great.
Cool, are we gonna hear from Alice Hank next?
Thanks. This is kind of going back to Ashley's question and just some wording in your response that is less directly tied to this discussion, though I think it obviously is, but to do with another debate that I tend to have with quite a few of my friends, to do with like intuition and logic, and how you use that word in relation to like idealism or non-idealism, because I think kind of the talk you gave and the role of case studies collapses the notion that we can have like kind of any conversation about idealism apart from like if it's in like that sense, not like realism, idealism, just keeping you like hiding in the fact that your automatic intuition is like somehow ideal, but then you bring in case studies to show that, to challenge that intuition. If it changes, then obviously it wasn't ideal, but also you can never, like if you take intersectionality seriously, you can't ever have like a full picture of the world. Like there would be no way, one way the world is. And so it's kind of two questions about generally how to subvert the notion of intuition and how it's being used, but also if you think there's a valuable or useful way to use idealism in that sense, other than to meet the establishment, the philosophical establishment, how it's already using the term idealism.
I might need to ask you some questions about your question, just to make sure I'm like understanding what you're getting at. So, so is the thought something like, look, hey, philosophers and philosophical debates sort of run on intuitions a lot of the time. And is the question something like, what use can we make of that as philosophers who want to sort of change things for the better? Like, is this kind of intuition talk something that can be repurposed for like feminist ends, feminist goals within philosophy? Or do we need to be like much more thoroughly suspicious of appeals to intuition and come up with a way of doing philosophy that doesn't appeal to them? Or have I misunderstood the question?
Yeah, it's kind of both of those. I'm thinking perhaps specifically of how just people saying, this is my intuition, and just using that as a reason for why they can do what they do, but people might have different intuitions, literally like in a logical argument or something, or like the rules of logic. But like I can also, like, it would be valuable, and it's valuable in your argument because we can change our intuitions and we use those perhaps like as maps to see where to go and to challenge them and uncover the assumptions. But that's like a collective effort, as I think your argument also showed. So my question, is about like the relation to the notion of idealism and how to use the word intuition responsibly in philosophy.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, so I think the idea that intuition is kind of used as a sort of kind of like a get out of jail free card, as it were, right? So something like, well, that's my intuition, I'm not going to be argued out of my intuition, right? And that this sort of this can be used to protect people in a certain kind of way, like it serves as a certain kind of intellectual protection that perhaps we think people often ought not to have or ought not to be entitled to. Yeah, see, on the other hand, I mean, when I'm teaching, you know, and I'll ask people what their intuitions are, and sometimes their intuitions strike me as bizarre and I don't like them. You know, I'm not talking about political intuitions, I'm talking about intuitions in like epistemology or whatever. And I'm just very aware, I'm very cautious of sort of trying to bully people out of their intuitions using, you know, whatever authority I might have as a tutor or something. So I do think, I don't want to sort of completely disavow the idea that people should in some sense be entitled to their intuitions. I think very often, the best way to sort of destabilize people's sense of intuitions as this kind of, I don't know, like way of entitling them is actually just to show them themselves how unstable their intuitions are. So again, I'm thinking not of anything in political philosophy, but just in epistemology. So there's this paper by John Hawthorne and Tamar Gendler called The Real Guide to Fake Barns, right? So these fake barn cases, as some as you know, there's this classic case in epistemology, right? So you're driving through a land with multiple fake barn facades, right? So there are all these like cardboard cutouts of barns basically. And there's one real barn, and you're driving along and you happen to look out the window at the moment when you pass the real barn. When you pass the real barn and you think, oh, there's a barn in this country, right? So you're supposed to have the intuition. The classic intuition here is you don't know that there's a barn, right? Because you could really easily have looked at one of the barn facades instead. So you really easily could have had a false belief. You would really easily believe that there's a barn when in fact there wasn't a barn. Anyway, so this paper by Hawthorne and Gendler sort of runs with this case study and then sort of tweaks it in a variety of different ways. And your intuitions are just pushed all over the place, right? So you go from thinking, oh yeah, you definitely don't know in the fake barn case to, oh, maybe you do. And then, oh, maybe you don't again, just with these very minor tweaks to the initial setup. Anyway, so the point I'm trying to make here is something like, even within sort of philosophy without any sort of political commitments at all, there are ways to sort of show people that perhaps they should be much more critical of their intuitions than they are. They should be sensitive to quite how easily their intuitions can be sort of pushed in one direction rather than another, just by sort of framing effects and these kinds of things. So I do think this is a case where there are resources from across philosophy for kind of criticizing what we might call like a bad use of intuition talk. I think the other thing to say is just that I don't think there's any replacement or any supplement for just careful reading about realities and history, right? So, you know, I think very often myself included, like, I just don't know that much stuff, right? And I'll have intuitions, and then I'll read a bit more, and I'll be like, oh wow, I was completely wrong about this situation. Yeah, so I think just in general, much more curiosity about sort of actual situations is indispensable in philosophy. So I would say, I think I would want to cultivate intellectual curiosity in people rather than try and sort of make them feel bad for having the intuitions they do. I'd want to say more like, oh, interesting, but you know, why don't you read this bit of history and see if you still have that kind of feeling about things.
Does that answer your question, I think?
Yeah, could I do a follow-up, which might have been answered, but just to like confirm. So like in relation to how you use the word ideal and like non-ideal, I think that's like an established way of using the word, but I think it's kind of like collapsed by this case study setup. So like I'm just curious if you still think that's a useful way to talk about things, or if we should like come up with a different way to talk about things.
Interesting. Can you say a little more about what you mean by collapsed?
Yeah, just like none of it seems ideal. I mean, you could be like idealist, like ideally I think I would like to achieve blah, but I don't think that's what it means, right? It means like you're saying like physics, whatever, like this is the way things are type of thing. But that's not the case with appeals to intuition that we're changing through examining their assumptions. And it's not the case by appeal to case studies, because I'm assuming being pro-intersectionality or some like there's going to be no one way or additive way, depending if I'm thinking like, just because you mentioned Christy Dotson, say like multi-stable intersectionality or something, there's going to be like no one way of objectively talking about the world. And so there's going to be no like ideal way there either. So like both sides of the situations, intuition and then appealing to case studies is ideal. So
I see. Yeah, give me a second to think. Okay, so I do think it's the case that this sort of notion of ideal, non-ideal, that kind of axis, I think you're right to point out that it's sort of the way it's used in contemporary discussions is it's sort of being used in an attempt to capture like multiple different axes of differentiation, and that it's actually not sufficiently nuanced to capture all the different distinctions that we might want to draw. And that, in fact, once we move away from what like classically might have been thought of as ideal theory, there are different varieties of non-ideal theory that we're going to want to distinguish between. And so, yeah, I think it's very plausible that like going forward in philosophy, sort of engaged political theorists are going to need a new vocabulary in order to draw these more nuanced discussions,
thank you.
Oh, thank you for that. Are there any more questions or any comments anyone would like to make? We do have a few minutes left if there is. If not, I am going to ask Rachel if you would like to give some final remarks.
Oh, I don't think I have anything to add to what I've said already, except that I'm incredibly grateful to have been invited to this and to have got such fantastic questions. And that I think it's incredibly great that you've been running this series. And I hope that you feel like you've got what you wanted, or at least part of what you wanted out of it. And I'm full of admiration for your sort of energy and dedication.
Thank you, Rachel. Yeah, I'm really happy. Like we've got a lot of people here to talk about carceral feminism and intersectionality. Like I'm quite impressed by everyone who's like showed up. So yeah, I'm really grateful that there is like an audience for this in Oxford and elsewhere.
And an 8th week.
Yeah, and an 8th week, exactly. So yeah, so it's been really fun. And yeah, this is the last one, so there won't be any more. I don't quite know how to say goodbye for for the audience and for the YouTube, I suppose. Other than to say that, you know, stay in tune with Oxford Public Philosophy. The journal will be coming out online fairly soon and may come out to libraries or something. We've got a podcast coming up in the summer, which is quite exciting. And yeah, various things. And yes, please do also talk to me if you want to be involved in kind of holding the philosophy faculty at Oxford accountable. So yeah, thank you for watching.
Great, thanks so much. Have a great summer, everyone.
Thank you so much, Rachel.